Hello and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam, and this week we're going to take a look at the top 10 solo albums by none other than rock legend Robert Plant. Robert Plant was born in 1948 in West Brom in the Midlands of England, like so many other rock stars we've talked about on Rock Records Reviewed. He joined bands such as Hobbs Tweedle and Band of Joy before finally hooking up with the new Yardbirds, who went on, of course, to become Led Zeppelin. We don't really need to go through the Led Zeppelin years here. We've done that elsewhere, and we'll probably do it again on some show in the future. Suffice to say that, the Led Zeppelin years took their toll, and I think by the time John Bonham died in 1980, Robert Plant really was ready to step away. He took 2 years out before finally embarking on a really interesting solo career. I think Robert Plant is following his solo career is quite fascinating because he's always exploring and trying new things. He's never really settled. He's always quite admirably wanted to develop as a solo artist, and so his solo career takes us through lots of different sort of incarnations. And I think with these records, although I'm being honest now, I don't think any of these records are brilliant and perhaps essential. I do really, really like all of them, including the ones that didn't make the top 10. Robert Plant himself, I find really, really likable. I think it would be very easy for a rock star of his stature to sort of disappear into your ivory tower and just lose touch really with the world around him. But Robert Plant's always tried to stay in touch with what's going on around him, and he's very self-effacing. He's very modest about his achievements, but clearly very proud. But at the same time, he wants to leave them in the past and move on and develop. I think he's really just a really lovely old hippie. If you watch him now, I mean, he in his interviews he never takes himself too seriously. If you watch the lovely episode of Brian Johnson's Life on the Road, he's sort of dressed as some ludicrous Viking character from Lord of the Rings with an enormous sword and his big dog. And at the end of the show, they're just larking about, him and Brian Johnson, on the beach like a couple of big kids. It's really endearing. Check it out. He takes his muse very seriously, doesn't take himself very seriously, but he loves a musical journey. And in interviews he often talks about jamming with Moroccan musicians at the foot of the Atlas Mountains, and I think he's always wanted to soak up the world around him and put that into his music. And you also must give him credit for refusing to reunite Led Zeppelin for a full tour. Despite Lord knows how many zeros he must have been offered on the end of some of those checks. I've included collaborations in this list because I think it gives a much more rounded overview of his solo career and who he is, but also because I think that those albums, those collaborations he's made, sort of merit being in this list. Anyway, let's crack on. So at number 10, I'm going to put from 2005 his 8th solo album, Mighty Rearranger. This is for me where Robert Plant found his new style and almost like a new muse. He was playing with the Strange Sensation, who he'd first played with on the covers album Dreamland, which is a very enjoyable covers album. And it's a company of musicians from bands as diverse as Cast and Portishead and Yah Wobble's band. And they were coming at it from a decidedly non-rock perspective. They seemed to give him a new lease of life because of it. He'd found a new voice with a backdrop of this sort of bluesy world music behind him, and it seemed to give him a freedom in the arrangements away from the 3-minute rock songs of previous albums before this. It also seemed to help him develop as a lyricist. Maybe the sort of lack of kind of rock construction just opened up his mind as a lyricist a little bit as well. Another Tribe, Shine It All Around, All the King's Horses, all really good songs on here. And the album itself was nominated for 2 Grammys and went top 5 in the UK. At number 9, his 11th and most recent solo album from 2017, Carrie Fire. He made this album with the sensational Shapeshifters, who were sort of very much an extension or a development, if you like, of the previous incarnation band, The Strange Sensation. This was self-produced by Robert Plant. He does like to self-produce a lot of his solo albums. And it's a very rootsy album, very similar to the one that preceded it. And there's a lot of ethnic noodling over some loops. And I think this album might be a bit higher if it didn't feel a bit too much like the previous album. There are some really good songs on here. May Queen, Carrie Fire itself, Bluebirds Over the Mountain, all very representative of the vibe going on here. And there's guest slots from Seth Lakeman and Chrissie Hynde, who seems to pop up on Rock Records Reviewed every week. It's a very, very enjoyable album, but it is very similar to the one that had preceded it. It was named the 37th best album of 2017 by Rolling Stone and awarded the best-selling Americana album of the year as well. It got to number 3 in the UK, number 14 in the USA, and you have to say, as his most recent album, that Robert Plant's solo career is in pretty rude health, both commercially and critically, because the papers and the magazines did really enjoy this album. And number 8, I'm going to put from 1998, Walking into Clarksdale. Now, this was a surprise because it was a collaboration with Jimmy Page. They'd previously got together to make an album called No Quarter, which is a really interesting reworking of some Led Zeppelin classics with Moroccan musicians and an orchestra and stuff. And they, in fact, they toured that as well. Nobody really expected them to go on and make an album a few years later, but they did, and it came as a surprise. But I really, really like this album. It was produced by Steve Albini, and he gives it a very lo-fi, muted sound. It's got these very sort of very dry drums and very rhythmic, acoustic, high in the mix guitars. Gives it a very peculiar sonic identity, I think. I think as a record, half of it really, really works. Particularly songs like Please Read the Letter and Shining in the Light and Most High. All really good songs with that dry sound. And it's really thrilling to hear Jimmy Page's distinctive guitar again alongside Robert Plant's voice across a whole record. It's probably 3 or so tracks too long. But, it was very popular. Got to number 8 in the USA, number 3 in the UK. And it might not have been a completely earth-shattering reunion, but this record was by no means an embarrassment. And in fact, because of the sound of it and the strength of some of the songs, I do find myself putting this on quite often. At number 7, I'm going to put from 1983, Honey Drippers Volume 1. Now, this is a real peculiarity in the Robert Plant discography. I think this is a really beautiful EP of old dance hall and rhythm and blues classics. It was the brainchild of Atlantic Records head Ahmet Ertegun, and he wanted to put this together, and he chose Robert Plant to do it. And Robert Plant at the time, along with the band, you've got Nile Rodgers and Jimmy Page plays on this again, and Jeff Beck plays on it. And there's only 5 songs on this EP, but it's really beautifully done with real love and affection for the original songs. And I think they sound really, really fresh because of Robert Plant's voice. It seems to just really, really work. He's doing a kind of crooning thing on this album, which he didn't like at first. There's a song on here called Sea of Love, the classic, which he didn't want released as a single because he thought it would label him as a crooner. And at the time, I think he was still sort of quite proud of being a bit of a rocker. But the song's beautifully done, and it was a huge hit. But alongside that, you've still got, Rockin' at Midnight on here, and there's enough rhythm and blues and swing and pizzazz to lift this above just the mere crooning, record. The Sea of Love was a huge hit in the States and topped some of the charts in North America. And I think if you don't know this album, then it's well worth investigating. There's an awful lot to enjoy in here, and it really sounds like they're having a good time. At number 6, I'm going to put his 10th solo album from 2014, Lullaby and the Ceaseless Roar. So this was his first album with the sensational Shapeshifters, who I mentioned earlier, and again self-produced. And you can immediately hear where we are with Robert Plant, you know, as the exotic instruments are playing licks over the loops to create this sort of atmospheres and vibes that almost defy sort of characterization. There's Indian music, there's North African, there's blues, there's Americana, there's folk, there's trip hop, there's ambient, and there's very, very little here to appease those early rock fans looking for some Led Zeppelin riffs. But, you know, there's still so much to get immersed in and enjoy here, and it's such a sort of intriguing sound and at times quite beguiling. You know, some of it sort of drifts off into nowhere, but in the most pleasant way you can imagine. And it takes its time. It's you know, there's nothing too fast and energetic on here, and it really does sound like Robert Plant has absolutely settled into a groove as a solo career with these albums. I think Rainbow is probably one of the real standout tracks here, but the whole album really does work as a journey into sound. You know, top 5 again in the USA, top 2 in the UK. But now we sort of move away from some of those sort of noodly ambient records, and we go back a little bit, because at number 5 I'm going to put his 4th solo album from 1988, Now and Zen. Having gone off the rails a little bit with dance music on the infamous Shaken and Stirred, which we might talk about a little bit later, this is a real return to sort of guitar-led music and songs. And, you know, I think this is Robert Plant really finally confidently coming to terms with his Led Zeppelin past to the point where you've got Jimmy Page playing on 2 tracks on here, and he even uses some Led Zeppelin samples. Some really good songs, Heaven Knows and Tall Cool One are the obvious ones, and there's some fun lyrics here, and Robert Plant seems to be enjoying himself a great deal. And it, you know, like I said, it really feels like he's finally sort of shaken off the heavy cloak of the Led Zeppelin legacy. Or if not shaking it off, then he seems to be wearing it more lightly. There's hints of Eastern music and influences coming in here, but I guess there always was really with Robert Plant. You just had to kind of listen out for them. And, you know, that's certainly a sign of things to come on later albums. He himself thinks that the songs on this album got bogged down in too much technology, but I think they stand up pretty well, and I think there are great tunes on here. In some ways, it's no less affected and forced than some of the sort of ambient grooves of his more sort of critically acclaimed later albums. And I think this is the point, perhaps, where, despite little sort of moments of solo success prior to this, this is probably the moment where he really starts establishing himself as a solo artist. I mean, he even played the Nebworth House at the Prince's Trust charity concert as a solo artist to 100,000 people on the back of this album. And it went top 10 both sides of the Atlantic and triple platinum in the UK, and his I think still to this day his best-selling solo album. So clearly in 1988, 8 years after Led Zeppelin, the Robert Plant name still had a lot of life in it. At number 4 from 2007, I'm going to put Raising Sand, his collaboration with the bluegrass country singer Alison Krauss. This was a real surprise hit, this album. You know, Robert Plant's always been fascinated by bluegrass and the way that families blended harmonies. And T-Bone Burnett was on board to choose the songs for this collaboration. And what they've put together is a really sort of moody, brooding album that simmers with kind of sexual and musical harmony and chemistry. And Krauss's and Robert Plant's voices work together absolutely beautifully. The album itself was lavished with critical acclaim from all quarters, helped by the cracking single Gone, Gone, Gone. But it's also got a brilliant reworking of Please Read the Letter from Walking into Clarksdale. And actually the album's full of highlights, and pretty much every track works. And it won Album of the Year at the Americana Music Awards and the Grammys. And in many ways, Robert Plant was as successful as he had ever been. But a lot of people think this is the album that kiboshed the Led Zeppelin reunion, because they had just played the O2 in London at the Ahmet Ertegun tribute to enormous fanfare and praise and acclaim. And everybody thought they were about to go on tour and Led Zeppelin were going to be back together again. But this album had come out around the same time and it had so much success commercially and critically that who can blame Robert Plant for thinking, actually, I'm not going to get back on that train. I'm quite happy with this album. And, you know, you have to admire him for that, for never really wanting to firmly put his foot back in the past and get on that gravy train. He's always been happy enough to do the odd gig with Zeppelin, just to honour people. But he's never signed up for the full reunion, despite the money he's undoubtedly been offered and the critical acclaim and the clamour from the fans. There was going to be a follow-up to this album, but for some reason it didn't work out. The sessions came to nothing, but I think they caught the lightning in the bottle on this album, and it may have inevitably been a disappointment, a follow-up. So you could say it's another wise decision by the canny operator Robert Plant. At number 3, I'm going to put his second solo album from 1983, Principle of Moments. His first solo album, Pictures at 11, had been a sort of messy, underwhelming, but still quite likeable debut. And he doesn't really change the formula much here. I think the difference is that the songs are better. He kept most of the same band, including Phil Collins on drums, Robbie Blunt on guitar. The songs are more rounded here. The arrangements are more coherent, and because of it, he got a couple of radio hits. He got "In the Mood" is a lovely song with a really fun, interesting vibe, and of course "Big Log," which is an '80s classic now. And yeah, the album does have an 80s vibe about it, but not in that sort of tight, horrible way where technology is suffocating everything. The sound here, I think, is still open, and you're still very, very much hearing musicians playing. The album went top 10, both sides of the Atlantic, but I think its legacy now really is the sort of the epic and moody, brooding Big Log, which is a song I still love to this day. At number 2, I'm going to put his 9th solo album from 2010, Band of Joy. This album is named after one of those bands he was in before Led Zeppelin formed, and I think this is the album where Robert Plant finally hits the real sweet spot between the melody and the more esoteric ambient vibes of his later albums. There are atmospheres on this album that you can sing, and that's a really clever thing to do. Angel Dance was the single and a sort of a kind of modest radio hit, but it's far from the best track on here. I love Silver Rider, which I think is a really atmospheric Robert Plant classic. Monkeys, a mooding, simmering duet with Patty Griffin, who very much takes the sort of Alison Krauss role on this album and does a really, really good job of it too. She sings backing vocals on sort of half the album here. There's a great cover of Richard Thompson's House of Cards. And I think he's also really, really got the sequencing right on this album. So by the time you get to the bluesy, dark Satan, Your Kingdom Must Come Down, you're invested totally on board with this record. Went top 5 in the USA, 3 in the UK, and I think this is a really solid, very, very good listen, this album. But my number 1 Robert Plant solo album is his 6th solo album from 1993, and that's Fate of Nations. So he'd made an album called Manic Nirvana, which is, again, very enjoyable, but it's very rocktastic. I mean, it really is Robert Plant kind of, going back into the past, something he'd never really done, and that's probably why I haven't put it in this top 10. Because I like hearing him developing and moving forward and talking about the Atlas Mountains and all that sort of stuff. But on this, on this album, he decided to go back and explore the artists who'd really influenced him away from rock music and into more interesting directions. So he cites Jefferson Airplane and Moby Grape and Fairport Convention and Traffic, amongst the others, amongst others. And he decided he was going to try and take the listener on a real journey with this record. And the result is Fate of Nations, which is a really fascinating record, I think. It's a bit of a long record, which is something that you'll know I'm not normally a fan of, but there's so much going on here, and all of it's really, really interesting. It doesn't all work, but I think that you enjoy the earnestness and the commitment he brings to this record. It's buoyed up by 2 killer radio songs, 29 Palms and I Believe, which are 2 of his most commercial and enjoyable solo songs. Definitely him at his most AOR radio friendly. There's an army of guests on this album, including Richard Thompson himself and Nigel Kennedy, the acclaimed violinist. So the album opens with the sort of Zeppelin-y Calling to You, but it soon veers off into much more rhythmic and ethereal territory with Down to the Sea and Come Into My Life. There's a lovely cover of Tim Hardin's If I Were a Carpenter on here as well. And I think this is one of the albums of his that you really can listen to over and over again and hear new things in. It really does repay sort of repeated listens. And also lyrically, I think he's got a much, much broader palette on here. He's singing about politics, he's singing about the environment, he's singing about dealing with loss, all those kind of things. And the sound is rich and full, and the playing throughout is really robust. And although the playing perhaps isn't as subtle as on some of his later records, I think it's very much in keeping with the sort of guitar music of the early 90s. And the album got to number 6 in the UK, got to number 34 in the USA, which was a bit low really, despite, again, both of those singles going top 10 on mainstream rock charts in the USA. But looking at when the album came out, perhaps everybody was spending their money on Nirvana's Nevermind instead. Oh well, their loss. Not their loss, I love Nevermind. Although Nirvana, another band we haven't talked about too much on Rock Records Reviewed. But look, that is my Robert Plant top 10. I think it's a really interesting journey following Robert Plant's solo career. As I've said, I'm not sure any of these albums are absolutely brilliant. You may think differently, and please tell me if you do. Away from this top 10, you've got Pictures at 11, which was his debut album, which was very, like I said, a little bit messy, but still very endearing for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. Manic Nirvana, with its rock riffs all the way throughout. Unleaded, he did with Jimmy Page, the reworking of the Zeppelin songs. Dreamland, the covers album, he did. And then Shaken and Stirred, the infamous Shaken and Stirred, which is such a crazy record. You must check it out. If you love 80s sounds and 80s grooves, then this album is essential if you're into that kind of thing. The songs are just bizarre, the sound is bizarre, the cover artwork is bizarre. It should be an album I absolutely hate, but I've got kind of fond memories of listening to it on holiday, and I kind of feel quite close to it. Not close enough to put it in my top 10. I can't do that. But I'd love to know, if you know Shaken and Stirred, what you think of it. Anyway, that's Robert Plant and his top 10 solo albums. An artist I deeply admire as a person and an artist, a developing musician who's never really settled and was always looking forward. I hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you again very soon for another Rock Records Reviewed. Bye-bye.